Hello. Hi. Welcome to Unitary Designation. Today I wanted to talk about something that's very interesting to me and something that has both metaphysical and political consequences. And that is silence. Now, silence is a very powerful thing. It's also a very dangerous thing. Silence has a long tradition in many mystical traditions. The contemplative nature of the Zen Buddhists and the monks in Catholic traditions and Protestant, of course, and in Hinduism too. In fact, in almost every religion that I know of, silence has a profound role. And I wanted to talk a little bit about silence because freedom of speech is such a contentious topic right now, and I've commented on freedom of speech prior, saying that it should be left, alone. And I think it's important to note that when we talk about silence, you can either take it in a political context, as in meaning not saying what you should say, right? Like not objecting to the right-wing extremists. That could be a form of silence. Not objecting to the left-wing extremist. If, however you want to define those terms, can also be a form of silence that is unadvisable. But then there's the oversharing aspect of your day-to-day existence. You don't want to always talk because, barring Twitch streamers, talking continuously is, well, it's not just risky. You might say something that's disagreeable, but it's also, people don't necessarily want to hear you all the time. Sometimes the power of silence and listening is very strong. And, the old phrase is, when you're silent, it speaks. It's partly mystical and just partly philosophical, like something what Freud might call the super ego, something that is unspoken assumptions of social discourse are at play when you maintain your silence. And that can be very helpful for people. And then there's the level at which the everyday, day-to-day life, the metaphysical, the spiritual, and the political sort of converge. And that's, that can happen anywhere. It can happen at work. Should you speak up now, risk HR wrath, or should you, maintain your silence? And what's the risks of silence? Sometimes you need to speak. Should you never speak? Should you always speak? Should you strive to compete for speech in a environment where it's not encouraged? And these aren't questions with a de facto answer. It's always case by case, situation by situation. So just because you have the balance of silence and speech figured out with one friend or with one peer group or with one work situation doesn't mean the same ratio applies tomorrow or next week or with a different coworker. And if you want to get technical about it, speech, I've read a bit about the literature on ADHD, and they seem to be torn between, the people who suffer from ADHD seem to be torn between those extremes of oversharing and, maintaining an uncomfortable level of silence. And that's very interesting. And, most of us don't fall into those two extremes, but it's possible to. And if you really want to wreck your relationships, all you have to do is not speak for a while. The dull silent treatment. So silence can be very powerful. The old saying goes, you're a master of your silence, but a slave to your words. And that's true. I mean, once you've uttered something, you sort of can be connected to that forever. If you've ever said any slur, that can be used to, attack your character and your integrity at any point. And so, yeah, you are very much a slave to your words. Even when you might have outgrown the stage of your life where that occurrence took place. And so, I might regret this video. I might regret all my videos. I might regret everything I've ever said. And you never tend to regret silence, except, in rare occasions when you're like, oh, I should have told her I liked her, or I should have spoken up against that heinous act. But silence has real consequences, especially when it's mass silence, when the majority do not speak up against what they see as inauthentic or, corrupt. And we've seen numerous historical examples of that, where everyone was afraid to speak. And in a population where everyone is afraid to speak, well, inauthenticity reigns, and your society, your culture is headed for a huge corrective crash with reality. So that's also not good. You want people to speak, you want people to share their mind, you want people to say, hey, this is getting too rigid, this is getting too loose, this is getting too extreme, this is not, listened to enough. You want people to share their voices, share their opinions. That's, what I'm doing here. But silence also is there's a wisdom in silence. There's a huge part of the Western wisdom tradition that is ingrained, like concretized, like that is rooted in silence, in letting others speak, listening, processing, contemplating, then formulating your response. And, you don't have to go into the poetry of T.S. Eliot, or the writings of Søren Kierkegaard to understand that silence can have a profound influence on your life. I think it was Tom Hardy who said that sitting by yourself alone at home in perfect silence is like it's the best thing there is, if I'm paraphrasing him correctly. People don't appreciate the benefit, like the strength of that. And yeah, there's definitely a temptation there to just let what you perceive as ethically, politically, morally, philosophically wrong. Why take that battle, right? Why speak up with all the risks involved? And that's usually how things go from bad to worse. If nobody speaks up, then, there we are. But, if you speak up, you risk ridicule, and that's what happened to Kierkegaard. He spoke up and he got harassed by the Danish press and the Danish Orthodox Church until he was, largely a ridiculed, abandoned figure, and that's how he died. And we remember him now as like this great forefather of existentialism and this like prolific prophetic thinker, but that's not necessarily what the people who live concurrently with you, what your age thinks of you. And so it's important to talk about that balance, right? When do you overshare? Like, not to get political, but there's a certain Canadian psychologist who tend to speak a lot and tend to, cut people off and maybe not listen enough. And it's hard for me to comment on whether or not oversharing or if you can talk too much, right? Because again, I agree with the argument that tyrannical systems emerge when people are afraid to speak truth to power. And we need more people, everyday people, to just share their views, uncontroversially, safely. Freedom of speech, right? Not freedom from consequence, but freedom to express what you mean. And there needs to be some level of space set aside for that. But then I also think, when do you know if you've spoken enough, right? When do you know if maybe you're on repeat and it would be best to maybe take a breath and not upload a new video every Tuesday and Thursday, right? When are you falling prey to people's preference for just hearing the rhetoric again and again and again, right? I tend to use silence as a guiding principle. Like, speech is more, in my experience, speech becomes more and more powerful the longer you are silent. Something to maybe keep in mind in your social interactions. If you feel like you're not being listened to, and you feel like maybe you have this sense that what you're saying is off or wrong, you're not able to find yourself in this conversation, just take a breath. Sit out the next 2 or 3 talking points and maintain silence, and then reintroduce yourself. It's like when you're working out, you don't always lift the weight all the time. You put it down, you restitute your muscles, right? And same thing with conversations. Just to get a little bit technical, I make these videos about 20 minutes long, not because I have a set duration plan for them, but because by the time I hit 20 minutes, there's usually this voice in the back of my head, this Hintergedanke, to quote the German, and it's like, okay, enough now, right? You've spoken enough. It's said. It is finished. And sometimes you have more to say, and but there's a wisdom in this sort of. It's my experience that silence seems to be the rule, and then you break the silence when it's required. And it's up to you to decide when is it mandated and when is it not. And to a certain degree, it's also up to the people around you. When is it okay to speak and when is it not? And if people around you tell you that you can never speak, get new friends, right? And if they always want you to share all the time, maybe you should reconsider. Why is silence so uncomfortable for you and your friends? So, yeah. So there's that. Biochemically, the most of the brain's activity is inhibitory. That is to say that most of the energy expenditure of the brain works on inhibiting brain structures. Like, the brain has a lot of interconnected regions that deal with specialized, subcategories of functionality. Some parts of the brain process vision, some auditory, some regulate emotions, some long-term planning. It's a very complicated mechanism. And instead of all the nerves firing all at once, the brain has a couple of regulatory mechanisms. One that I know of is the GABA system, GABA. Alcohol regulates GABA, or that is to say, it alters the functioning of GABA, so you become less inhibited. And I think stimulants, I know caffeine regulates GABA activity, and the people with a higher inhibition ability, I don't know if there's any research on this, but I would imagine that people with the ability to delay gratification also have the ability to regulate inhibition better. And that's the ability to delay the gratification, which is a sensitivity to dopamine, has been shown in research to correlate positively with long-term life outcome in terms of education, personal finance, happiness, social status, etc. So that's something to keep in mind. So the ability to regulate yourself and the different areas of the brain inhibitory, like when to be quiet, when to speak, it seems to be regulated with something like skill, or wisdom or functionality or adaptability. Like your ability to function in the world seems to be regulated to knowing not what to say, but when to say, right? Not only what to say, but also when to say. And silence is very tempting in that regard because it's sort of like a default do no wrong, right? You're rarely accused of doing something wrong by maintaining silence. And it's very tempting. And speaking up and having difficult conversations, taking responsibility for like your family or like your job or like your marriage, silence is very easy. And speaking up sort of, it's very hard, if not impossible, for speech to originate from something else than a emergent preference. Like the brain wants something to be different than it currently is. Either your relationship, your work, just the channel that's on, the heat, the temperature, the volume, the water in your cup. I mean, like speech, in my experience, most often follows a desire for a change in what's currently occurring. Silence seems to be accepting of what is already occurring. And I've never heard someone, gotta think about this, I don't know what it would sound like if you spoke without wanting to enact some form of change. And so even if all you're doing is sincerely just trying to get your thoughts out, it's still because you want the thoughts to be better formulated, which is a form of change. So speech is always rooted in the altercation of being, and it seems to be some types of change is, acceptable. You want the heat to be, you want the room to be warmer, that's fine. And then some forms of change you want to enact is not acceptable. You want society to look a certain way that is not good, right? Unacceptable. And because speech is this mechanism that both those things emerge from, it's easy to target speech, but that's very unsophisticated. And wanting other people to be silent sort of robs them of their autonomy. If all you want from your spouse is silence, it's tempting, I understand that, because, we have a finite amount of cognitive capacity, and our day-to-day existence is copious enough without having to process unnecessary stimuli all the time. But speech is also a form of thinking. And to the degree that we love someone, we're also, this gets into the nature of love and attachment and relationships, but it's difficult for me to say that I love something without wanting that thing to grow. And if I don't want something to grow and reach its potential in an Aristotelian sense, eudaimonia, then it's like, how much am I obligated to listen in order for you to develop yourself? And I think I'm trying to convey how complicated an issue silence is. Because on the one hand, it's very tempting, it's very powerful, it's very dangerous, and it's very it impacts all your level of being. Silence in your own mind, freedom from this constant stream of ideas, silence in speech, silence in action, absence is also a form of silence, or it's a form of, communication. It's difficult to say. There are mystical traditions that state that everything comes, that everything emerges from silence. And that's sort of true, I mean, not physically, right? Not molecules emerging from the concept of silence, but speech is sort of breaking the pattern of silence, or it's emerging a pattern within silence. Like, you have a baseline of silence, and then speech can emerge. When this video is over, silence is going to be there. And you can put on a new video or listen to music or something, but there will always be that backdrop of silence that you're, how would you say it, putting something in. And, I've had certain psychedelic experiences where I could sort of like connect with that silence more, and it was very pregnant. It was very full and rich and not scary. It was so much content of information was in that silence that putting on music seemed like not an affront, but it seemed like a waste. And I do believe that is there all the time. So I'm troubled by this notion that it's your obligation to speak a lot. I mean, politically, yes, when something is wrong and it hurts you to your ethical core to see, speak up. But then also, when does it stop being a legitimate response, and when is it just an excuse for you to receive the applause and the adulation and the prestige of being well spoken? Like, let's say I objected to a legislative endeavor, right? And then I received some form of notoriety from objecting to this legislative move. And then I used that notoriety to launch a podcasting career where I went on endless tangents about the structure of existence and reality. At what point should silence come back into the mix? At what point do you owe it to yourself to be quiet again? I'm aware of the temptations of silence. I'm also aware of the people who cling to silence, being afraid to speak because they have nothing to say. I understand that framework, right? If you say that, well, at least I'm daring to speak, right? I'm standing up and saying what I think. It's like, okay, yes, that's laudable. But when do you stop? The answer is not never. If the answer is, if I stop talking, the devil or the demons will take over, then you're off your rocker. So, silence is a complicated matter. Because we have this capacity for speech, right? This capacity for articulated thought. And that's why podcasting and YouTube and the internet, for crying out loud, that's why it's so powerful. Because we can share our ideas, we can share our souls with each other online. We can create these intellectual landscapes that couldn't exist in a day-to-day struggle on the savannah of Africa, 200,000 years ago. And not using that, just sitting in silence and, not taking advantage of that opportunity seems almost sacrilegious because of what we've done. But if everyone speaks, no one ever listens. And that's what Bo Burnham said in his Inside special. Can anyone please shut up, right? And he spoke and I'm speaking, and there's a Socratic irony in that. There's also like a humorous concept that he goes on to address that. He says, I know I'm talking, but blah, 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 blah. But there's that balance thing again. When should you be silent? And when should you speak? And it's like, I said earlier that it is case by case. And it is situation to situation to situation. That's what the Zen people are so adamant about, that, you know, life has to be lived moment to moment to moment to moment, and you sort of have to pass these dharma gates. You have to pass through these challenging existential scenarios, moments, and even in Zen koan practice, they use speech to like evaluate if the student gets it or not. And you'd think, like, being Zen monks, right? You'd think these holier than thou, mystical sort of ascetics would be all about silence, right? But no, speech and chanting and use of vocal cords seems to feature strongly. So it's like, it's a very there's no simple answer to this. And you know, a lot of great thinkers have spent a lot of time contemplating silence. A lot of great philosophers, a lot of great mystics. So yeah, what in 21st century, in 2023, as a informed, educated world citizen of the Western, you know, climate, world view, should you consume, and what should you consume, right? Like, your own silence, listening to TikTok, Twitch, you know, frivolous YouTube shorts, just this endless stream of, you know, not nothing, but things of varying substance. Is that silence your consumption? Or is it a form of loud speech? Like, is your consumption of mass media on a mass scale constantly, are your actions then saying something? Like, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to speak, I don't want to be silent, I don't want to sit by myself with my own thoughts. I mean, we're at the stage where sitting at home with your own thoughts in silence is sort of like a, dare I say it, it's almost like a political move. Like, yeah, like you're objecting to this constant sort of performance culture. And I know that people who abuse certain medications, chemical components, I won't list them for reasons, censorship algorithm reasons, but, you know, stimulants of varying degrees, medical or illicit, you know, even caffeine, energy drinks, you know, all this stuff. I know that they tend to create this this tendency to be very active, produce, and, you know, and I wonder if maybe we're not supposed to always say everything that comes to our minds. Maybe there's there's a space for listening that we're not taking, that we've sort of neglected, and everyone's busy. Yeah, it becomes important what you say, right? Silence and what you say becomes sort of like, if you're going to speak, then are you obligated to only say things of substance? Or are you do you owe it to yourself to say nothing? Should you say only what you're knowledgeable about? Should you never expand your competence? What should you do with your time, with your speech, with your time, with your chance to articulate yourself? Because your silence will not live on in a final sense. Your words may not either, ultimately, but they will surely last longer than silence. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe silence not living on is a good thing. If there's a case to be made for, I don't know, reincarnation or something, then, having words constantly from, I don't know how that would work, right? Or if there's an afterlife, having your words matter, then it's that gets speculative and obviously, outside the realm of the political, at least. But yeah, it highlights the point. If there's no consequences to speech metaphysically, then, why not just say whatever you want all the time, right? If all that matters, if all the consequences of your speech is only tied to, if the only risk of speech is getting fired or jailed, then, that it's what you're prepared to say is tantamount to your risk of firing in jail. But if there's something like metaphysical to speech, to like articulated thought, to the logos, right? Then it's then it's a different thing. And then silence is either like a rejection of responsibility or an acceptance of like this sort of like stoic higher truth. So it's like silence is both of those things. It can be used to hurt. It can be used to protect, I suppose. Like being at home with your spouse and just enjoying each other's company in silence can be like the most transcendental experience ever. And the same scenario, being at home with your spouse in silence, can also be the most miserable thing in the world. So silence is not silence, right? There's different. Silence is not just the lack of words, right? It's the. Yeah, it's a complicated series of. Silence is more than just lack of speech, I suppose. So yeah, I don't want to give any kind of suggestions on how to use speech politically, because it's not for me to say whether or not your opinions should be uttered. I mean, I would rather that people uttered their opinions and got corrective feedback, and I would rather that process wasn't so charged to the point where you can get, damn near traumatized by saying the wrong thing in the wrong setting. You're like, you see the other person is just, and you're in a different place than you were 5 seconds ago. And I would also that people didn't abuse that goodwill of freedom of speech to just say things that they know are harmful and just troll with it. So it's like, it's a complicated issue. It doesn't have any clear prescriptive tendencies. It keeps coming back to that issue of like case by case by case on terms of like what should you say and when. I guess I should take my own advice and be silent. What do you guys think about, silence? Is it a shield? Is it a deflection? Is it cowardly? Is it heroic? With everyone speaking all the time, is actually refusing to add fuel to the hypothetical political fire? Is that heroic, or is it cowardly to not participate in political debates that needs to be had? Lord knows there's enough speech on social media about controversial political issues. Is it heroic to not participate? Is it cowardly? Is that a wrongful dichotomy? Is it even right to ask? It's I'd like some input on that. So feel free to comment on that. Otherwise, thank you for watching. This has been a longer video than usual, but I'm happy to do that when it's mandated. And yeah, have a good day. I hope to see you around. Thanks for sticking with to the end of the video. Goodbye.